we think about solar electricity, there's some myths that we need to dispel this morning. And if you don't take away anything other than what I'm about to say, this is the primary myth that should go away. Solar is 3 times the grid rate. It's impractical. The only people who adopt solar are those who are environmentalists or have some kind of mission they're trying to project by putting some type of demonstration project on the rooftop. That was true in 1970. That was true in 1980. That was true in 1990. It was also true in 2000. It is no longer true today. Solar electricity can be grid parity today with no fundamental investment in technology. The investment's already been made. Not only my company, but others such as First Solar, Nanosolar, we have the panels that can provide grid parity pricing. So pricing is not the issue. Another aspect of the mythology of solar is that we want to reach the highest possible efficiency, the highest possible power conversion. How many photons get turned into an electron? We want that to be as high as possible. A lot of academics spend their entire careers trying to push that curve up as high as possible. The problem with that is it's the cost efficiency that matters most, not power conversion efficiency. Efficiency at any price is one of the issues that has stalled solar in the past. So instead of thinking about the watts of output per square meter of solar irradiation, you also have to think about the dollars of cost per square meter of solar panel produced. And you divide those numbers to get dollars per watt, and suddenly you're thinking about cost efficiency. If you think about that over the lifetime of a solar deployment, then you're thinking about cents per kilowatt hour, and now you're comparing that exactly against a utility system. That's called the levelized cost of energy. Anybody who comes to you with a metric other than the levelized cost of energy, you should take that and transform that into the levelized cost of energy. That will help to level the playing field, thinking about exactly what the cost of solar might be against some other technology. Now, having said that, why isn't solar everywhere right now? Well, partly because the panels that are at this price point are just now coming out. But there's another more fundamental issue in that a lot of us think of solar as a residential solution, something that goes up on a rooftop. 5 guys pull up in a van, they climb up onto a roof, they spend a week installing solar and they leave. That's not practical. Where solar really needs to play is at the power plant scale. We're talking megawatts to tens of megawatts to potentially even larger. If you leave the airport in Munich and you're driving into the downtown, if you look on either side of the freeway, you see solar panels to the horizon. All the dairy farmers in that area have converted their land from harvesting milk to harvesting light. So from that standpoint, what we're talking about is a fundamental reperception of solar in the United States, partly using the European approach, which is thinking about power plants, thinking about how to incent different governments in a stable way to allow solar to grow, in part through feed-in tariffs, but also thinking in terms of where solar would be deployed in the US. Where it's likely to be deployed in the next 10 years, if we're going to approach this, are large power plants near grid tie-in points and high levels of solar irradiation. One of the challenges here is that there's not a strong mapping of the grid infrastructure to solar irradiation. If we can put up the first slide here. First, this slide shows you solar irradiation. The darker the color, the more the irradiation. So not surprisingly, the Southwest United States is the location where most of the sun hits. Now, if we wanted to have a grid infrastructure that could leverage that, we'd expect to see a mapping onto that. But if we look at the next slide, a lot of the demand, if you look over on the right-hand side where these are overlaid, those white lines are the grid in the United States. They're focused on the northeastern part of the United States because that's where the demand has been strongest over the past 100 years. And so it's a demand-driven rather than a supply-driven strategy to grow the grid. But you see where the sun is the greatest, there's the fewest amount of grid interconnections. And of course, there's finer scales in this. But the point is that there's not a one-to-one mapping of this particular renewable energy resource against where the grid tie-in points matter. Now, why does it matter to be near the grid? Because you can produce electricity for very low cost, but if you have to transmit it over long distances, that adds to that cost. So I would argue that, for example, solar is less expensive than nuclear today, because nuclear proponents generally don't take into account the 10 cents per kilowatt hour average transmission cost. They figure out the cost of nuclear at the site of generation. When you do a levelized cost of energy calculation and you take into account transmission along with generation, you really get a much more accurate picture. So it's mapping the renewable energy resources against where the grid infrastructure would allow an economic tie-in to the grid. That's critical. Finally, there's another source of potential solar power, which is really relieving node congestion in dense urban areas where there could be, for example, rolling brownouts or blackouts. If one were to install 1 to 10 megawatt type of deployment sites in conjunction and collaboration with various regional utilities, node congestion could be released in those areas, which would add additional value. So we can imagine seeing municipal power plants outside a city that is specifically sited to relieve congestion in that city. So both the large power plant that would be scaled in the Southwest United States and the regional power plants that would be smaller and sited to relieve node congestion don't exist in the United States today to any great extent. There's a handful of demonstration projects at that scale. But that's where public policy needs to move towards in order to leverage the technology that already exists for solar.